Ladies and gentlemen, the session is about to begin. Please take your seats. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, the session will begin now. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the conference. The session about reforming the multilateral system, report of the G20 Independent Expert Group on strengthening multilateral development banks will now begin. Please welcome to the stage the chair for this session, Suma Chakrabarti, chair of ODI board. And now, please join me in welcoming on stage the speakers for this session. Woo Chong-um, Managing Director General at the Asian Development Bank. Rebeca Grynspan, Secretary General at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Donald Kaberuka, former President at the African Development Bank. Carolina España, Executive Vice President of the Development Bank of Latin America. Homi Kharas, Senior Fellow, Global Economy and Development of the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings Institution. Vera Songwe, Chair at Liquidity and Sustainability Facility and Co-Chair of the High-Level Panel at Finance for Climate Action. And N.K. Singh, Chairman at 15th Finance Commission of India, Co-Chair at G20 Expert Group on MDBs. Suma Chakrabarti, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome back, everyone. I'm Suma Chakrabarti, as the announcer said, Chair of ODI and former President of European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, and I'm really, truly honored to have been asked by EMF to chair this panel, this wonderful panel on reforming the MDB system. We have an outstanding speaker, my old friend N.K. Singh, here, and a distinguished panel, and I don't think I need to introduce the panel, can save time, because you've been introduced now by the announcer, which is very helpful indeed. Now, this morning, colleagues, you heard about all the global challenges. We had an excellent session also on climate finance, and then with Ngozi on re-globalization, as she called it, and trade. I think the question of the MDB's role, for me, came up in all of the sessions this morning, and I'm sure they will later on today and tomorrow as well. So it's very timely, in my view, that the Indian presidency of the G20 led to the creation of an independent expert group, co-chaired by N.K. Singh and Larry Summers, to look at what MDBs should do to respond to these global challenges, their mandates, their financial firepower, their business models, and how to do more, frankly, than the sum of their parts, how to work as a system as such. The independent expert group was supported by an excellent secretariat. Volume 1 is already published. I hope you've all seen it. And Volume 2 is about to come out at the end of this week as well. So without more ado, what I'd like to do is give the floor to N.K. Singh. He'll offer his preview, if you like, of the whole report and ahead of the G20 seminar and its launch. And then we'll have some reflections from each of the panelists to a set of questions, I think really about how they assess where this report has taken us and how we're going to actually take it forward after it's approved by the G20. So without further ado, I'm going to ask NK to take the floor.
Audible?
You are.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you very much, Suma. First of all, let me say how honored I am at the opportunity to be with old friends, several of them I see instinctively, who have been engaged in this multilateral development business for much longer than I have. See, Renda, Monte, so many, and this great opportunity to say a few words. As you mentioned, Suma, this is not the first time that the presidency of any G20, which only in 2008 began enlarging the ambit of the G20 framework to centrally include economic and social issues. And the first reflection of this was evident during the presidency of Germany, when they appointed an independent group led by the current president of, the newly elected president of Singapore, Tharman, Shanmugaratnam, who is also privileged to have him as a member of my group. He gave a very far-reaching set of proposals on reforms of the multilateral development banks, many tangible ideas on what could be done. The story, therefore, had begun. And thereafter, it was really the Italian presidency which took the initiative to set up a group on the capital adequacy framework report designed to primarily optimize the existing balance sheet. I mean, there was overall recognition that the world needed, for multiple reasons, vastly more resources than the MDBs had. Of course, to some extent, is a bit of fiction in this because private capital is dramatically and multiple times higher than what any amount of what MDBs can provide. But nonetheless, the MDBs, since this has been mentioned by you, Suma, have, of course, I still recognize, got a number of virtues. I mean, they are predictable, transparent systems of working, they are long-term, they are able to borrow at AAA, preferred creditor status, and they have a degree of confidence and an ability to influence policies of sovereign government. So MDBs, in a certain sense, remain still a very important piece in the framework of international economic architecture. And therefore, I think there is a great degree of relevance to see how they can be made more purposeful. Now, this group, thereafter, the last presidency under Indonesia took some steps to implement this capital adequacy framework reform, but still in some ways pretty tentative. When the Indian presidency assumed, in the second meeting of the finance ministers and governors of the central bank, so to give you a ballpark, all of you are familiar, each of these presidencies have basically several tracks, most important, of course, being, I mean, the most multiple of which being the track under the foreign ministry. There's the Sherpa track. Montek has been a former Sherpa. Multiple staff on the Sherpa track. And then, of course, there's a finance track. On the finance track, each of these have, of course, each tracks have 4 meetings. In the second meeting, they decided to constitute the finance track, an independent expert group. And I'm privileged, along with Larry, to be a co-convener of this, with a fairly wide range of, in terms of reference of addressing various issues and what are the kinds of malaise which afflicts the multilateral development banks. We had a fairly intense set of discussions. It was difficult to meet physically. We were in different continents, but we met rather regularly, and we met with a degree of tenacity. It was greatly helped that we had great degree of support from the secretarial support, both from under Mr. Masood, heading the CGD, and Ikriar, based in India. We came up with the first report, which I had the privilege to physically present to the finance ministers on the 18th of July in Gandhinagar. And the core proposal of that first volume was that we called it the triple report. We called it a triple report because the idea was to triple the volume of lending by the multilateral development banks. The one ballpark figure is all multilateral development banks, when added together, let us say without the bump in the pandemic year, were lending about $120 billion. Our intention was how to triple that 120, getting it close to the 400 mark by getting in itself 300 billion of concessional finance, add non-concessional finance, add to it the concessional finance, which we expected would go up from 30 to 90 billion, and get closer to 400 billion per annum. So that was and we did that by giving a framework on how this objective could be achieved. And we also added a new mechanism, which we call the Global Challenges Fund in that first report, designed to address the issues of fragility, pandemic, climate, and other related issues. So that was volume 1. There was a robust discussion around volume 1, and I must say very helpful discussions. And many of the multilateral development banks have on their own, and the number keeps going up, begun implementing important ingredients of the report. At the time of the spring meeting of the IMF and World Bank, they had come up with a paper called the Evolution Paper. That Evolution Paper was largely based on the report of the Capital Adequacy Framework Report, had some very useful ideas. But it is a tribute to the extent to which they can act on signals that just a week ago, or perhaps 8 days ago, the World Bank has come up with a second paper, which they will present to the Development Committee tomorrow and day after. And that contains already several of the important ingredients which we have mentioned in the first report. Not perhaps to the same extent, like for instance, illustratively, they have recalibrated the equity loan ratio by lowering it by 1 percentage point. We, of course, expect them to do a little more daunting. On callable capital, I think it is still very tentative. On private capital, they are a bit shy of still taking on targets and so on and so forth. But they certainly, it's a very, very positive change in this second report, which is now before us. As we go forward, tomorrow at 6:30 p.m., to be precise, Suma, I would have the privilege of presenting the second and the final report of the independent expert group to the finance ministers and governors of central bank. And after that, of course, it's in public domain, except that perhaps it is held up because technically the closing statement of the finance minister comes before this comes on the website. But anyway, for all practical purposes, after that it is. Of course, needless to say that once you submit a report, which I did on the 27th of last month, it is circulated to all the deputies, and hundreds of copies are made and circulated. So everybody seems to have it, except that I'm perhaps want to obey the norms or not speaking directly on it. But to give you a broad picture, since you wanted that, Suma, while the first report, we called it the triple agenda, in terms of tripling the volume of overall lending, tripling the mechanism from just IDA and IBRD to now a third one, which we call the Global Challenges Fund, which will begin small. I mean, that is designed principally that countries who wish to lend for a specific purpose, there's a lot of funds floating around which wants to perhaps find security and comfort, and multilateral development banks are an obvious place for them to be able to do so. And we have provided a new kind of an arrangement or a facility, and that's why 3 mechanisms, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the concessional finance one, which is the IDA, and this one to address the global challenges. Now, what does the second report do? The caption of the second report is better, bolder, and bigger banks. So so we articulate what do we mean by better. We mean better by dramatically improving, let us say, to give an example, let's say if the average time taken between a concept note and the first disbursement is on an average about 26 months, 24 to 26 months in an MDB. We have given proposals which can cut it down to 12 months, a significant change. We have given proposals on how processes and procedures can be significantly simplified. We have given proposals of how the MDBs could work as a family and in greater congruence. What can they share? What can they find in commonality? And how, therefore, the outcome becomes much more than the sum of the parts if you begin to have the symmetry in the working of the MDB family as a whole. So there's a whole host of proposals on how to make it better. How to make it bolder? Well, one of the things which we found, is for good reasons, is that there's a huge degree of risk aversion on the part of all MDBs. I mean, nobody wants to tamper with AAA rating. Nobody wants to tamper with preferred creditor status. But within that framework, can you take little more daring, informed risks, so to say? And a whole lot of proposals on how to make them bolder in being able to use different forms of capital, hybrid capital, blended finance, and variations of that kind to make them bolder. And bigger, of course, the obvious one, which I mentioned earlier, of how to take their overall lending from close to 120 billion to around 400 billion, and how to harness in this process private capital more efficiently in terms of what are the risk factors which inhibit private capital in being able to make investment decisions. Could it be, say, for instance, uncertainties on foreign exchange fluctuations? Could it be on account of regulatory framework? Could it be on account of other factors? And how to address these set of issues in a more purposive way. So the second report really is, therefore, better, bolder, and bigger, with the objective, ultimately, of having the capacity to do, between them and the private sector, $1 trillion a year, 500 coming out of concessional, non-concessional, and 500 coming out from private capital. And why did we do all this? We did all this because in a number of papers, of which Vera was a very distinguished author, Nick Stern is attending here, Nick is here, Amar is also here. They wrote a very credible report, going from millions to trillion, and we estimated roughly that we would require $3 trillion a year, out of which $2 trillion could come from domestic resource mobilization. We were questioned about the veracity of this by many shareholders in Gandhinagar, and we said, okay, you find another report which is better than this. OECD more or less comes to the same figure. UN reports come to the same figure. So in the absence of, we are not a research organization, in 2.5 months' time, we will give you the arithmetic of a different kind. So we adopted this of 3 trillion and 2 trillion from domestic resource mobilization. Of course, on domestic resource mobilization, I must tell you, Vera, you were not there when Rachel was there, another very distinguished colleague of mine on this board. When Kristalina, managing director of the IMF, asked the question, everybody is talking about NK's 1 trillion, but what about the 2 trillion of domestic resource mobilization? And I told her that, Kristalina, that's your baby, because you do all the reforms. That's quality of your Article 4 consultations. That's the advice that countries expect the International Monetary Fund will give on improving tax buoyancies and kind of supporting structural changes inherent in this. But I think that people were listening. So in this second report, which the World Bank has put out, of the World Bank Group, Vera, you must have noticed that there is a very robust paragraph on domestic resource mobilization, which focuses on tax reforms, structural changes, and fostering growth, and so on. So there we are. I think that, let's see what happens. So far, I can tell you that the MDBs themselves have, by and large, welcomed both Volume 1, but more than Volume 1, the Volume 2 of the proposals. 4 days ago, the Indian presidency, which is the finance minister, had convened a meeting of all heads of MDBs, where I had also the privilege to speak. Larry spoke on the virtual mode. And I found across the board a very large degree of support by the heads of MDBs. So the traction has been reasonably good. The question is how much traction there exists from the G20 themselves. What's the amount of pushback? What's the appetite today, given other distractions? And what is the leeway that the MDBs, even if they make up their mind within the structure of governance and decision-making within each MDB, the shareholders would permit them to take decisions which are germane and which are meaningful? These are questions on which we could hardly deliberate too much, but there they are. So thank you very much, Suma, perhaps I've overstepped my time. Forgive me, though. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. thank you very much, NK. That's a wonderful sneak preview of the report. If you haven't read it, when you get it, do read it. I think it's an absolutely humdinger of a report, if I may say so. Donald, I know you've got a hard deadline, 3:15, and it's all my fault because apparently ODI has booked you for another event. So can I give the floor to you? Here we are, both of us former MDB presidents. How would you have reacted, looking back on your time in terms of the recommendations? How would you have taken them forward? What do you think is particularly important? And particularly here we are in Africa, to think about which of these recommendations really matter for Africa in particular.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Suma, for allowing me to leave earlier, because indeed I have to follow your instructions. You invite him to 2 events at the same time, so I have to obey both. I have just 3 small comments, and I'll be quick. Number 1, excellent report. Especially the second one, I liked it very, very much. A lot of thought has gone into it, and I'm hoping that shareholders of these institutions really give it full backing. I just have one little comment. And please, I'm sitting on the extreme left, so it might be seen as coming from that side. You see, these banks can be bigger, better, and bolder, but there's something else that they have to do, especially in Africa. And here's the reason. In the 1980s, when Africa was going through a whole range of economic reforms, there had been a report from the World Bank called the BEG report. It was called Accelerated Development in Africa. Now, many years later, when we look at it, it was very ideological. It was a very ideological document. Basically, it posited that for Africa to move forward, it has to adopt root and branch the neoliberal economic agenda. Now, you may think that is a long time ago, but memories are still fresh on this one. So, if these institutions have to be better, bolder, and bigger, they have to figure out, so what is it that makes development? If somebody has an answer, they should tell us. But now these countries have a whole menu of options on what constitutes development, and they're no longer prepared to be boxed into a particular approach to development. It is as important as more money, as speed, because if you take out the ideological gap from these institutions, it will make them more flexible. So I'm from the extreme left, so take it for what it's worth. Second point, maybe the last. You know, during the Arab Spring, Suma and I did something which is quite unique, and our colleague in the Inter-American Development Bank. And from this, you can see what these institutions can do when their shareholders want them to do things. So I was faced with a problem in North Africa, which is 40% of our portfolio. And so the risky concentration had become just too high. What they call the RAC ratio was just out of the way. And there was a risk of losing the AAA. So what do? I talked to the head of Inter-American and the World Bank, and I said, look, our shareholders are the same. So Inter-American, you're having a big problem with Argentina, huge exposure to Argentina. I had one on Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco, all right? Our shareholders are the same. So our financial engineers brought up something called exposure swaps. So essentially, we treated them as one balance sheet for some loan portfolios. And immediately it liberated so much space for additional lending without calling for additional capital from the shareholders. But some shareholders were far ahead of others in accepting the exposure swaps. So what I'm saying is these institutions can do quite a lot when their shareholders agree for it to happen. And then Suma came in. The bank he was leading was a European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Some of us thought they have done very well. And we discussed whether this European bank can actually be active in Africa. For me, I didn't see any problem because EIB was already active in North Africa. But 2 particular shareholders of AfDB, and I suspect 2 of EBRD, did not want EBRD to operate in North Africa, which I think was ridiculous. But eventually it happened. I think EBRD now is operating in North Africa, and that is very good for the countries. So if shareholders want to change, these institutions can do quite a lot even with the capital they have now. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Donald, indeed. And I may say, I think you as a leader were very much thinking about the system. And I think that's one of the issues that's coming out of this report, is incentivizing leaders to think about systems. And you certainly supported EBRD coming into North Africa, different business model, private sector focused, and we really appreciated your support, for sure. Donald, I know you have to go. If I may turn to Vera, who's also a member, of course, of the independent expert group. Vera, you've written so eloquently about financing issues, climate, IDA. It'd be really good to get your take on particular financing aspects that have come through in this report, the challenges that you see ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, thank you very much. Of course, under the leadership of NK and Larry Summers, and the penmanship of Homi here. Three things about financing, and I think this is one of the things we were trying to maybe bring across in the report in the bigger part, but also maybe in the bolder part. In the bolder part, we talk about how, you know, the MDBs can take more risk. And essentially, to take more risk, we need to understand, you know, what does the private sector bring to the table in terms of risk-adjusted rates of return. We know from the climate side, and I just saw Nick has left, the report that we wrote, we say, just so that the numbers are clear, in the report that Nick, myself, and Amar did, we talk about 2.4 trillion. That's just climate finance. In this report on the MDBs, it's 3 trillion. Because in some sense, there is that additional bit that is not necessarily going into the climate, but it's the same. But for the external financing that we need, we're all asking for 1 trillion and the leveraging of 1 trillion. What are we talking about when we talk about that? It's really about guarantees. It is an amazing, and you know that better than most of us, Suma and Donald. You know, for every $1 that you put in guarantees, you're able to get $4 of an investment in. So it's a powerful sort of equity tool that does not require you to have the cash at hand immediately. And in our systems, and I think this is one of the things actually that we're also talking about when we talk about the MDBs working together, is that a lot of times at the end of every fiscal year, there is some MDB that still has guarantee capabilities and one that has run out of it. If we could pool those guarantee capabilities, one could actually do much more, much better, much faster. The other thing that we talk about, of course, is, and I'm sure because most of you are part of us, is the MDBs really have to be the ones that do the de-risking. They have to come in at that particular point of project design that is the most difficult, not at the time when you can actually find private sector financing for it. And we hear increasingly from the private sector of crowding out, MDBs crowding out the private sector. And I think what we try to insist on in the report is precisely that, is to say, can MDBs make sure that they come in at the point where they de-risk, but also mobilization. One of the things that we do not do enough in the MDB system is we have tended to ask just the private sector arms, so you know, the EIB or the IFC or Africa 50 to be the one that does the mobilization. But a lot of mobilization can happen in the public sector arm of the MDBs as well. And finally, on the equity side, we need to have skin in the game as MDBs. We have not had enough skin in the game as MDBs. We've done loans, which means we ourselves don't believe in the development process that we're actually putting in place. And as we know, equity is a much longer game. It brings in the kind of knowledge transfer that one needs because when you put equity, it's your resources and you really do want a return. So I think these are some of the finance issues that we are trying to unpack in the report. And as NK was saying, the privilege of working with him is that some of these things are already now happening in the MDBs. As in the 6 months that we've been writing the report, the MDBs are beginning to say, oh yeah, we could actually do this and we could actually do that. And finally, on the financing side, one of the things we've heard from the private sector is they want scale. You know, when you talk to a Bank of America or a Citibank, they don't want to go into a country and do a $100 million investment. They want to do a $3 billion investment. And we just saw them do something like that. Siemens just did $8 billion in Egypt. Those are the kinds of investments that will actually bring the change that we need. As we say, the world is in crisis. If the world is in crisis, 100 million doesn't change it or doesn't stop the crisis. We need a lot more. And so we're hoping that with this capital increase that we're asking for the bigger MDB system, we can have the scale that is needed to fight the problem in front of us effectively.
Vera, thank you very much. Really, all of those points you make really land, I think, and particularly the equity ratios. I mean, they are very variable between these banks. And it's not really explicable other than risk appetite, I guess, between the banks. That's something the private sector will be looking at, for sure. Scale as well, you mentioned. Can I ask you a follow-up, which is really about something that my former boss, Gordon Brown, wrote about in The Guardian recently. I have to say, after a discussion with me, but I was too late to claim patent for this one. It was really about the supernormal profits, I would say, that oil companies and countries that are producing oil have made in the last few years. We know we've had this debate about windfall taxes in the UK, for example. What about going back to the 70s and recycling some of this, as we did in the 70s from many of the countries, Kuwait Fund, Saudi Fund, all these things were created in the 70s because of this. And I had hoped maybe for COP28, this might be an initiative that might come through.
Yes, so that's the COP28 report. No, thank you, and I'm glad you asked that question, because one of the things that we found out as we were doing this Bigger, Better, and Bolder report is essentially that for IDA, the International Development Association, which is sort of the fund for the poorest at the World Bank, for example, the shareholder contribution to IDA has not increased since 2012. Let me just repeat. Shareholder contributions into IDA has not increased since 2012. It has consistently been going down. And so even though, you know, the teams at the World Bank have done a fantastic job of sort of raising a lot of IDA, and we keep hearing, you know, this year was better than the last, essentially we have done that on the back of countries themselves. So we have increased costs to the Ghanas and the Cote d'Ivoires of the world that are trying to grow. We've made it more difficult. We have shortened terms. And so what we are saying in the report for IDA, for example, is, you know, can we triple IDA between today and 2030? Because we are in danger of meeting the SDG goals. But coming to your question, and this is the link, is essentially one of the reasons why it's been difficult to raise capital is because of the shareholder voting and voice issues. But 5 countries in the world, because of the Ukraine war, have made an extra $1 trillion in profits. Countries, corporations, PPP, we won't name them, but Norway is one of them, I think I can, UAE and the rest. And so one of the things that we're calling for is this sort of hybrid capital model, where maybe you can put money into these institutions without necessarily upfront changing the voice allocation through this global financing mechanisms. There's a hybrid structure. And I think one can do that and actually move forward. The second one is taxes. The global taxation call is still on the table, but because you need sort of every parliament to ratify it and all, one of the things that I have been sort of asking for, and I think yesterday I listened to Kristalina and she seems to be agreeing with me on that, is rather than us, you know, talking about a lot of taxation, let's do carbon pricing. Let's price, right? And since many of these countries do want to abate their pollution, and their emissions, we can actually work much faster towards a carbon pricing mechanism. And there again, that's where the Better Bank system works. If the MDBs work together and came up with, so this is the roadmap for how we can do carbon pricing, I think we can actually get there and get almost $1 trillion out of that. So there are 2 mechanisms for getting resources out of this sort of new windfall gains from the fossil fuel sector. In our report for COP, we're talking more about carbon pricing and how we sort of make sure that that actually works. We have the voluntary system in Europe and the compliance system in the US. We should be able to deliver a system for the developing world sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much, Vera. And the one bit of the Berg report that I remember that Donald mentioned was basically getting the prices right was actually quite fundamental, even if, you know, it was very much a night watchman state that Berg wanted. But I think Montec this morning talked about prices, getting prices right, relative prices right. So that's going to be an important part. Let me turn to Homi. First of all, congratulations, Homi, because I think you were holding the pen, as Vera said, throughout this process. It's a great report. Many congratulations to you on your authorship. You've, like me, been involved in a number of these processes before. What makes it different this time? Why do you think there's traction this time that will get us this report, perhaps unlike the predecessors, with strong MDB support, shareholder support, and management support as well, to move forward with these great recommendations?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So I think there's perhaps traction today because I think almost everybody recognizes that we are actually all in this boat together. I mean, all of my life and career development has, to a large extent, always been a little bit of an afterthought. You know, I've called it a nice-to-have kind of thing, but when things really got tough, development was always the thing that fell off the priority agenda when, you know, other more important things came up, and other more important things always did come up. So it was never really given the kind of sustained attention that it deserved. Now I think because of two things. One, developing countries are so much larger as a share of global GDP that if they don't grow, the world doesn't grow. So they have become really important for everyone's well-being. And two, obviously, climate, pandemics, the global challenges that we all know about, even conflict that can spill over. And so development in many ways has actually become an imperative. It's no longer something that's nice to have. If we don't get developing countries on board with a really focused, vigorous development and climate agenda, it's going to be very, very difficult for anyone in the rest of the world to really have a prosperous economy. That, I think, is a massive change in context. It's one that's now, you know, understood. And just to give you a little bit of perspective on this, investment rates in Africa, public and private, amount to just over 20% of GDP on average, maybe 21, 22%. Exactly the same is true in Latin America. If you have an investment rate of just over 20%, there is zero chance that you're going to be able to transform anything. This is public and private. This is your total, this is what you are doing in order to try to change the trajectory of your economy. When you look at all of the countries, there was a lot of discussion earlier about, you know, India and how India has now gone. India used to have low 20s rates of investment. They were stuck in the so-called Hindu, rate of growth. Then this big jump, over 30%. So we're talking about the possibility now, if you really want to have transformation, of needing to have a step change in the volume of investment. And then people say, how are we ever going to be able to do it in some of these countries? And the answer is, they're going to need financing. It's got to be stable. It's got to be affordable. It's got to have long maturities. And even though, you know, we say $1 trillion, it sounds like such a mind-bogglingly large number. Actually, what we're talking about is 3% of GDP. I mean, if you put it like that and you say to somebody, what we're really suggesting is that you run a 3% of GDP current account deficit and raise your investment rates by a significant amount, and that's going to allow you to do all of these, really good things. I don't think anybody would say this is a big problem. And the glory of it is that in many ways the MDBs don't need to change what they do so much. They need to change how they do it. But in listening to the discussions, you know, what a difficult, uncertain world we're in. How can one possibly have a development strategy? If you just think about it, is universal cheap energy unlikely to be something really central to any state of the world? No, of course we want that. Food security, digital, human development. So all of these things, which I would call foundational, it's very robust to any state of the world that one can imagine. So I think that also adds to this feeling of comfort that there are real things that one can do that will use this money in a very effective way. And ultimately, for continents like Africa, which right now, Vera was telling me, pays on average 28 cents per kilowatt hour. The new renewables contracts that are being signed in India are coming in at about 3 cents per kilowatt hour. What an extraordinary game changer that could potentially be. So I think technology is also part of the reason why there's this sense that now is the moment to really act and why things might be different now.
Thanks very much, Homi. I think must say I'm much more optimistic about this report being taken forward than I was in previous contexts, both because of the quality of the work, if I can say that to all of you. I really think it's high quality work and it's detailed in some places as well. But the second thing I think Homi, you're right about, that probably previously we didn't think that we had a burning platform. We certainly got one on many fronts. And if we don't do it now, can't see whenever we'd do it. So I think we have the context as well, which has changed, which I hope shareholders' managements will take into account. We will be time for some questions. We're running well within schedule, which is good. I'm going to turn now to Rebeca. Some people, Rebeca, say that this report hasn't said enough about what it would mean for the least developed countries. I think that's probably untrue myself, but I'd like you to draw out, because given your UNCTAD job, you have so much to do with the least developed countries. What do you think this report is saying for those countries?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me start by saying that I think that the job that has been done in the first report and in the second report is fantastic. And it's the only thing that has traction right now from all the proposals about the international financial system and what can be done even, right now with the resources that are there. I think that this is the only thing that has really piqued the imagination and hopes of so many. So that is so important, really. And I would say that if the report will be taken in its whole, it will make a huge contribution. The problem is that it will be pick and choose. And that's what I think that in a way is happening. And that's the problem also with the LDCs, yes? If you have a menu that together makes, really a difference, but then you say you take the 1 and the 3 and the 5th that they may not mean a lot together. And that is the problem with not doing bigger at the same time as better and not doing better at the same time as bolder. and I think that something of that is being discussed. Yes, those that will have to put the capitalization for the banks to be bigger don't want to do it before they are better, and then we are in this lock, saying, no, we need bigger and better. And let me give you only one indicator that we have been repeating, and is that the World Bank is today a 1/5 of what it used to be with respect to the global economy in the 60s. So in fact, what we are left today is with an international multilateral system that we all need for this to work that is too small to the challenge. And it's true that the banks can get better and the model have to change, and there is the callable capital and the ratio and the risk taken. I think that all of that is very important to be done, but if it continues to be done in a very limited capacity to scale up, it will be a problem. And the second problem is speed. Yeah, if we will take 1, 3, and 5 and not 2, 4, and 6, and it will take us another, how long, NK? We started with Germany, we went to Italy, then we went to India, now we go to Brazil. 3 more years will pass, and that's it. The train has left the station. We are not going to really get to the 2030 agenda. Yes, and that is like the core of the problem we have now. So we have to keep the eye on the ball. We have to keep the coherence of the proposal. We need to push for it to really happen together in all the points today. That is my first point, including IDA, that was maybe more prominent in the first report than I hear, because I haven't seen it. Like you say, it's still under embargo in the second report. So I think that the IDA part is very important, and for the LDCs, we need to continue taking that. This is my second point. Is that just to give the people that is with us a sense of what we are talking about, yes? And is this what we call the development crisis? And that's why this is so important. Really, the countries today have to face impossible decisions. They are impossible, 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more in servicing the debt than in education and health. And these countries don't have not the fiscal space. Taxes, in that sense, are important, and domestic mobilization. But, they don't have the capital to be able to do the transformation, to be able to do the investments that we need for the global good, for the, for the climate change. These countries, LDCs, the least developed countries, that are 46 countries, 1.1 billion people, they receive 2% of foreign direct investment in the world. So if we don't do something with the public money of the multilateral system, they won't be able to make it. Yes, alone or only the market won't do it. Won't make it happen. And my third point with respect to the LDCs is that they not only don't receive foreign direct investment, they don't receive investment for the climate change transformation. Yeah, we know that is because of risk, that is because of many of the things that you have been saying, but that, again, go back to my point. If we don't fix the problem at the multilateral level, these countries will just be left behind. So there is a development crisis. The LDCs are being left behind if we don't take the agenda in its integrity. This will just reproduce itself and nothing really major will happen. I need to do one last comment here, and is that it's not only the LDCs, it's also what we call the frontier countries, yes? It's the Ghanas of this world. And I think that they have to be really put with more emphasis on this. The emerging economies are not doing bad. Yes, Brazil, Mexico, India, Indonesia, China, they are growing pretty good with respect to the rest of the world right now. But the frontier countries are not. Those middle-income countries, middle-sized countries that went to the private markets and now they have no access to them are really suffering today. So this agenda, I have to emphasize, is very important for those small and medium-sized countries that cannot make it happen alone and will need the complementarity of the multilateral system with the private sector scaling up for their development.
Rebeca, thank you very much. And what you say is really important, but also very sobering, actually, in terms of the challenge for the least developed, but also the frontier countries. I remember about a year ago, Homi was giving me a tutorial on a visit to Washington about the situation in Ghana, particularly on net resource transfers. And I hadn't realized how sick the numbers looked, actually. So it's really good to have that reminder of that. And there are specific issues in those countries that need to be addressed too. Let me turn to the two members who are actually still working in multilateral development banks, unlike the rest of us, Wu Chong and Carolina. It would be really important, I think, for the panel and for the audience to hear how you see it from the inside. I know you've got to be a bit more careful with your remarks and perhaps those of us who've left. But nevertheless, Wu Chong, let me start with you. When you've worked at the ADB, as you reminded me, for 30 years, ADB has always, in my view, been quite creative on the financial side. And so one big issue for, I think, is what sort of leadership can you see from ADB in terms of challenges, the opportunities, in terms of taking this triple mandate forward?
Thank you very much. First of all, I got to thank Harvinder and Rajat for putting me on this incredible panel. And this is the perfect panel for me to be in because, as you said, I'm still in MDB. Last 30 years, maybe for another 10 years, maybe. Over the last 30 years, I've seen many different voices about what people say about MDB. And I've never heard so much praise and so much, onus put on MDB to do more. So clearly, we have lots of work to do. Now, the challenge is that can we deliver, right? So, but the good thing is that, as you say, ADB has been quite innovative in doing a lot of different things to meet the challenge that we face today. Just 5-6 years ago, we decided to merge our ADF, our concessional window, with our ordinary capital, which basically doubled our lending headroom to become like $25 billion. And then we set up a new strategy for long-term strategy, which actually mapped out all the things that we need to do. This was in 2018-19, and we even highlighted the issue of the health security. And back then, not many people in ADB knew what that meant until a year later, when the pandemic hit. We do need to support the developing countries in being prepared for things like pandemic. But then the climate change is continuing, and the impact's getting even greater. So in 2021, we decided to increase our target of $80 billion over 10 years to $100 billion in climate finance. But there was some pushback from some shareholders, and this is one really important point that I want to make. We do need to walk with our clients, developing countries, so that they understand why we do some of these things. And in 2021, we are still in the midst of dealing with the pandemic. Many shareholders wanted us to stay away on climate change until we get the pandemic sorted out. But because we are known as the family doctor who knows the patients, we had a very deep policy dialogue and conversation, which convinced them this climate is not something for somebody else, but for the countries themselves. And then there are a lot of other crises coming up. So, we knew what we had to do in terms of substance on the ground, but we need to make sure that we need more money. And we also knew that there's competing demands with respect to the donors. So not much money is coming from there. I do agree with the report that at some point, the shareholders need to provide us with additional financing. But until that happens, we have to do what we can to squeeze more money. And as you probably heard, in ADB, our CAF review is producing $10 billion more annually, which is taking us from 26 billion to 36 billion, which is 360 billion in the next 10 years. But is that enough? We don't think so. We need to do more. So we are engaging in some of the new initiatives. One is this international finance for education, your former boss and Gordon Brown's agenda, to use the guarantee from the donors to guarantee our outstanding portfolio that unlocks at least 5 times the guaranteed amount. And so we are the pilot MDB doing that, and we are almost ready to launch that. And then as we are looking into this, we said, hey, how about for climate? We can do the same thing. So we actually made this climate version of the IFID. It's called the Innovative Financing for Climate for Asia Pacific, which does the same $1 guarantee from the donor would unlock $5 of additional headroom. So we are targeting right now $3 billion of guarantee, which will unlock 15 billion. So on top of our CAF, we have IFID and we have IFCAP. But still, is that enough? We don't think so. We need to mobilize more private sector capital. So in that sense, we just recently reorganized ourselves to make 2 major shifts. One is on climate shift, to do everything we do in terms of, especially resilience, is we need to focus on, plus the mitigation actions, but also on the private sector shift. So we are tackling 3 streams, upstream, midstream, and downstream. So upstream is creating that enabling environment for the countries to be able to be ready to attract more private capital. The midstream is doing more of the PPP project development so that private investors can see more bankable projects on the ground. And then, of course, the downstream, which we invest into loan and equity investments. So hopefully with this combination, we can take our billions into trillions. and you spoke about the challenges. Two, one is cultural change internally as well as the shareholders. People in our space are extremely risk-averse, as the report highlighted. So we have to be not to be afraid of doing something brand new, something that no one's ever done. The last challenge is people. We can't just go from 26 billion to 36 billion to 100 billion, just like that. We need people, internal AfDB staff, and also all of the MDBs to be able to mobilize more experts to be able to develop projects, because the projects don't come from thin air. And last point, our MDB collaboration, I think we've seen a lot of changes in that. Many years ago, we saw each other as sort of competition, but now we are seeing each other as part of the team. It actually started in our project we worked on, Homi, Kharas, and on Namtun 2 hydropower in Laos, where World Bank and AfDB worked as one single team. And we are seeing more of that. And we feel that the competition is not with each other. The competition is with time, especially on the climate. Unless we act on it right away, we're going to run out of time.
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate that last comment you made about working as a system. I mean, there's safeguards, there's so many other things that need to be improved. Imagine the transaction costs that are imposed on ministries of finance in emerging markets, developing countries, from each MDB wanting to do its own country strategy. I mean, just unbelievable time spent. If there's one thing I think the country platforms could achieve, that would be that diagnostic tool should be just uniform, I think, and a single one. Woo-Chong, thanks a lot. Let me turn to Carolina. CAF, one of my favorite MDBs, actually. Latin American, Spain and Portugal as well in members. You've got an interesting membership, I think. Interesting task. So similar question to you as to Woo-Chong. How does this triple agenda, how do you take it forward within CAF?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank for this invitation. I think this is a very interesting and relevant panel for us MDBs. And I would also, it's an honor to be here with my all-time boss, Mr. Garcia. So we totally are, like my colleague said, we are totally in agreement with the report. I think the report addresses, the urgency to scaling up, be more bold, be more flexible, be more ambitious with our solution and with the solutions to our client, and also with promoting this urgency towards the climate phenomena. In regards to the three elements of the agenda, I would like to say, well, first of all, the first one, it's very much aligned with CAF, and that's something that dates back from Mr. Garcia's vision to support sustainable development and regional integration. And today we want to be the green bank and the bank of inclusive growth of Latin America. So, so it's very much aligned with that vision, and we have design and strategy that it's allocating 25 billion US dollar from now until 2030. And basically, it will tackle climate action, biodiversity, conservation, energy transition, and also all social inclusion and inclusive growth. But that's the core of our mandate today, and we are. I think something that we are doing is also taking into account the nature of Latin America. And Latin America, it's being affected by the climate phenomena, but Latin America has not contributed as much as other regions to climate change, but it's being affected very severely. So in that sense, we are helping our countries to protect biodiversity. And in this regard, we are prioritizing solutions as those ecosystem services, and we are promoting those kinds of actions. Also, in the front of reducing carbon emissions, we do not want to let the reducing carbon emissions agenda compete with the economic agenda. So in that regards, we also are prioritizing the gas as a transition energy for the continent, so that we can contribute to fiscal sustainability. So I think in terms of mandate, in terms of objective, we're fully aligned. In terms of scaling up the financing, I think in that regard, we had back in 2021, the board approved a 7 billion capital increase for the bank, the largest in its history. And I think that's a very, great commitment. I think that will allow us to double our portfolio until 2030, but that's not sufficient, as you mentioned in the report. I think more needs to be done, and for that we are looking for additional members who can provide callable capital and that could support, you know, the scaling up of our operations in the continent. We are also very conscious about the need to partner with other MDBs, regional banks, development banks in Latin America to find different solutions. And I think that's something that I think it has been said here, but coordination, it's very important. We want to be effective, and we don't want to overlap between the actions of the different actors in the development community. So that's quite important for us, and we are looking at coordinating not even, only among development institutions, but also with the private sector and local governments and national level and local level as well. In terms of also scaling up, we are looking at different instruments to bring into the private sector. We have one very important instrument that was led by Mr. Garcia, and that was an asset management company, and that was designed to finance infrastructure and to mobilize resources from all parts of the world, and also from local investors to finance infrastructure. That has proven to be very successful, and we have 2 cases in Colombia and Uruguay, but we are in progress with Costa Rica and Paraguay. But still, we need to do more of that. We need to promote more of those type of vehicles that allow us to bring in the private investors through APPs, and also through other type of services arrangement. We are also promoting the use of SDRs. We are one of the MDBs that have been approved to use SDRs, and we have done that for 2 transactions. So that has proven the first case was first 2 cases were successful, and we are looking at that as a strategy to promote climate finance for some countries that are quite vulnerable to that. Debt for nature swaps. It's something that we are looking at very carefully, and we, since the region has a lot of natural capital, we think we can provide that and can use that as a tool to scale up the financing for climate finance. Then we are looking at other instruments of de-risking in terms of basically transfer the risk mechanism of risk transfer. And for that, we're looking at the insurance, guarantees, and other structures like the AB loan structure, so that we can encourage private sector participation in our projects. Of course, for us, coordination and mobilization are on the top of our agenda, because we are quite conscious that funds are not enough and we need to act quickly. I think one of the CAF advantages is that CAF is a very flexible bank. And in that regard, the processes are simpler maybe than other institutions, but we need to work more on that. And we need to increase our efficiency so that we can reach the ambitious goals that have been proposed in the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. I think a number of very important, detailed sort of responses already from both CAF and Asian Development Bank. I think your SDR work is going to be quite a case study, actually, for the system as a whole. I'm going to ask Enrique Garcia to come to the podium in just a minute, but before I do, can I see if there are any questions from the audience? Maybe 2 or 3 we can take together. Yes, I think they're handheld mics, so if we go to this lady here first.
Hi, so thank you so much for the discussion. My name is Winnie, I work for African Development Bank. And so mine would be interesting in terms of twofolds, and looking at the discussion we had, I followed at IMF, we had a breakfast session regarding the reforms within MDBs. And so mine would be 2 things. What is your thought about the special drawing right that the African Development Bank is suggesting? Do you think it's doable? What do you think in the context of the reforms that we are currently undergoing? There could be weaknesses or pros and cons to the special drawing right. That would be number 1. And then number 2 would be, we have spoken so much about the reforms, about a bigger, better, bolder, and I'm really happy to hear this would be the second and the last report. Then how do you think sooner we are going to see this kick rolling? I would really be sad to see the next IMF, we are still talking about proposed reforms. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And the attention will be on here on NK, Vera, and Homi in responding to these questions. I'll just take a couple more and come to you over here, Mr. Ocampo.
If I remember right from the G20 communique, there was a call not just for more money, but for wider voice or representation. So to what extent is that being addressed, and is it having traction? Some, of course, have indicated that there are informal laws, like rules, like World Bank's always headed by an American, IMF's always headed by Europe. The second question I have is, as you try to be bigger and bolder, is there also a case to be made about being more responsive? In the sense that if you're going to amass more money, are you going to concentrate it all in one institution, say World Bank, IMF? Or would it be a good strategy to also boost these other regional development banks, particularly since a few new ones have even come out in response to the issue of getting bigger voice and being more responsive?
Thank you very much. I'm going to take 2 more. One right back there, next to Siddharth.
Good afternoon. Alexei Alexishvili from Georgia. So my question is probably mostly to ADB and then Latin American Bank. So the question is that, you know, still the main recipient of this benefit of existing MDB, having MDB, is the developing countries. So, and then looking at developing countries and sometimes discussing this issue, many times some urgency, some specific issues, specific topics comes out, like climate change or some disasters or some particular issues. But time to time, like, we forget about the good governance. And I'd like to pay more attention on that, because paying attention on efficiency of MDBs, when you are talking about reforming those institutions, how we can improve this efficiency in terms of good governance, and what kind of tools can be used for that specifically, and how we can increase the ownership coming from those countries per se. Because in many cases, we all understand that as a main recipient, as a main goal of those countries, then this is somehow missing.
Thank you very much. Last two questions. This gentleman over here, and then this gentleman in the middle there.
Werner Hermann from Switzerland. My main takeaway from this panel is that everybody wants to invest much, much more, and urgently. Simple question, what are the macro consequences of that, and what do you plan to do?
Thank you very much. You, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. So 2 points. One, main presenter, Mr. NK, spoke about doing better. And in that context, you gave just an example. Maybe we can't talk too much about the report, but the example you gave, for example, on shortening project start time, the time between approval and the start of the project, that to bring it to 1 year. But many of these elements, including this one, actually don't depend on the NDBs. For example, project needs to be approved and ratified by Parliament. How do you factor that in your own process? The other aspect is, we're talking about increasing capital. We speak all the time about the bank, the bank, the bank. Nothing against the bank, but the question is that there are many other institutions there. Just CAF here, IFAD and others. What is the place of those institutions in your overall study in terms of increasing availability of resources for development? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We haven't got time for any more, unfortunately. Let me turn to the panel. NK, do you want to kick off first, or Homi, or Vera?
Homi, you go first.
Homi, you got a mic? Yeah.
Let me take a couple of questions. First, on the macro consequences. There's been a fair amount of modeling that's been done largely by the IMF about what would happen if you had a bigger investment push, both in terms of implications for current account deficits, implications for creditworthiness, etc. I think that the conclusions from those kinds of models, which are country by country, and they've done it for about 60 plus countries, but you get a real sense from that analysis that if the projects are done right, if debt is actually used for investment, even though you get a increase in the medium term of debt to GDP ratios, you actually get an improvement in creditworthiness. And I think that you don't get much of an impact in terms of inflation. You don't get much of an impact in terms of real current account deficits. But where you do get impact is the higher levels of growth that are generated by higher levels of investment also help countries to mobilize domestic resources. And so this other part of the equation that we were talking about, which is the domestic resource mobilization, actually becomes feasible. If you're not growing, then it's very, very difficult to then talk and think about, raising taxes. At best, you can do a little bit of reallocation from here to there, but we all know that if you don't have zero-based budgeting, that's a very difficult and limited process. So I think we look quite closely at the macro consequences, and at even though we're talking relatively large numbers, I don't think that the scale is such that it would have adverse macro consequences. Rather, I think it would have very considerable positive macro consequences. Very quickly, in terms of sort of, voice and responsiveness, and here, if I may, I just, this morning, for those of you who were here this morning, I thought that we had a very inspirational kind of a challenge to, look at what it is we really trying to do. What is the soul? What is the voice that emerges? And I was thinking, when we think about the MDBs, which tends to be a very technocratic and dry kind of topic, but actually there is a soul and spirit there. And it's a soul and spirit of what I would call servant leadership. This concept that somewhere in the multilateral system, there is a real desire by a number of people to have a collective leadership that is trying to look out for the global good. And of course, national priorities are part of that global good, but there's also something a little bit more. And if I had to say what's the sort of the underlying part of this better MDBs, it's that they no longer think of themselves as being just technocratic experts who know the answers to development better than anybody in the country. They really are trying to help countries find their own path to development. And I think Donald Kaberuka was hinting at that when he said there are so many different kinds of ways. And then finally, sorry to take up so much time, Suma, on responsiveness. I think that, and voice, if the MDBs actually unpack their capital stack and permit non-government stakeholders in the hybrid capital, in the portfolio guarantees, if they allow those stakeholders to express their preferences, as they are also proposing to do, then even without a change in formal, chairs and shares, etc., I think you'll have a very different conversation within the MDBs. And if there's something, I would almost say that that's potentially one of the most revolutionary parts of this proposal. It really opens up these institutions for a discussion and a dialogue with a range of stakeholders who up until now have essentially been said, well, if you want to join us, here's how, but never really asking about what is it that, what do you bring to the table and what are your experiences and what can we learn from you in that. And that's how I hope that this kind of new form of voice will be expressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Homi, very much. That's the Global Challenges Fund that very much was in the report. A very interesting idea. Both EBRD and IFC did go down this route with equity participation funds, which brought in sovereign wealth funds, but it was a hard slog, persuading, frankly, the shareholders to allow them in. So, but it's been done, so it can, I think, be built on. Vera, anything you wish to add to those questions, and NK?
Take the SDRs question. I think two things on the SDRs. The first is that, very happy that they were released. There's a discussion, the IMF review is going on. I think we have said in the report that, we should look at reissuances of SDRs on a much more systematic basis, but also that those SDRs should be on lent to regional institutions. So in principle, I think if you just look at the sort of cost of SDRs versus, Ghana going to the market at 800 basis points or Angola going at 1,100 basis points, it's a no-brainer, right, that borrowing SDRs at, 10% is much, much more interesting and can restructure debt and move us forward. Actually, probably the fastest way to the G20 framework is that. So I think, but again, we have, and this is the conversation which we don't have in the report, is a question of, because the SDRs are in the remit of the IMF, and we were not necessarily, since the IMF review was just about to start, this report does not deal with the SDR question upfront, other than to talk about the need for additional capital and the fact that some SDRs could help leverage additional resources. So we don't deal with it, but it is in principle, I think, something that we should be thinking of doing more of and better of.
Thanks, Vera, very much. I'm going to ask NK to come in at the end, just before. So I think I'll just take 1 point from Rebecca, and then I'm going to invite Enrique to come to the stage.
Yeah, two tweets. Very important SDRs going to regional banks, and the CAF example, and it could be an important part of this. We have to push for it, and there are many obstacles, but I think that can be a very wonderful vehicle, like Vera is saying, and there is a very good proposal from the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. And my second point is about voice and governance. I think that we have a problem, and we are not advancing on that respect. I am not so sure, Homi, that the one size fits all or I know better has gone away. Not so sure. And the diversity of voices can be a very important part. The empowerment of other countries in the boards of these institutions, the diversity that is needed to have a more meaningful discussion, different from the past. I think that is still, a point in the agenda that is not being addressed as we will want to. And probably this is because of the China question, yes? That doesn't allow this to go further. And that's the truth. But what we are saying is that if we don't reform the governance and voice of these institutions now, we will have a fragmented international system. And that's something that we need to avoid, something that we don't want. And we still have time to preclude that from happening. And I think that the governance and voice part is an essential discussion that we need to address.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. So thank you very much for those questions. Obviously, we didn't answer everything, but you'll get a chance in the coffee break after this to talk to the panel as well. Let me ask Enrique Garcia, the former...
Suma, can I just say one thing?
Yeah,
because
sure.
a couple of times it came up. It's called the MDB report, because actually we are looking at all the MDBs, not just the World Bank and the IMF. And I think there's some very fantastic examples from the AIIB, for example, in terms of speed and all that. So just to say that it actually is across all the MDB streams. Of course, they have different periods of capital increase, and the World Bank is the one that's coming sort of close by, and IDA, so we talk about that more. But we are taking examples from everybody. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vera. Let me call on Enrique Garcia, former president and CEO of CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, but also co-chair of this Emerging Markets Forum, a veteran of these issues, really. So, Enrique, your reflections before we sum up.
Well, thank you very much, Suma, for giving me the opportunity to make a few comments after this excellent panel. And congratulations. I'm so glad to see that the issues of the MDBs has been tackled. Because my life, all my life I've been related. I started my romantic life with the multilateral development banks in the IDB as a young professional, and I worked in the IDB 18 years, different positions. I was the treasurer of the bank. Then I was elected president of CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, and I was president for 26 years. And by the way, I didn't change the constitution to be reelected so many times. And at the same time, I know them. This is a great occasion, but a few comments. The first one, no doubt, we are living in a different world. Not only the fourth industrial revolution, the fact that tensions in the world started almost 10 years ago, but we have now all the critical geopolitical situation. And the worst situation is that the gaps between regions and within regions and in nations in economic and social elements are great. The warming, very climate warming. So there's no doubt that this is a challenge that the MDBs have the opportunity to move in the direction to be effective vehicles in this process of change. But the devil is in the details. It's easy to talk, we have to change, but let's be concrete. And the first point, I think, is crucial, that capital increases have to take place. I know I was treasurer of the IDB, and we used to have regular increments of capital. They couldn't have an increment of capital for many years. The World Bank the same way. The only one, CAF, was able to do that within the members, which are essentially from Latin America. So that's point number one. Second element, governance. Of course, after Bretton Woods, it was very clear what was the geopolitical situation. Now the things have changed. So representation in governance has to be adapted to the new reality. Well, that's not an easy task, but it's necessary. Third, you have to have institutions with very strong financial situation. Why? Because you have to have access to the international capital market. So you have to keep your investment grade ratings as high as possible. And that vehicle is very important because one of the roles of multilateral development banks is not only to finance directly, is to play a catalytic role. Why? Because they have the capacity to stimulate programs and projects that are supported by good feasibility studies. Procurement policies are competitive. It's a very important thing. And you follow up the projects. So that's an incentive for the private sector. Trust funds, wealth funds, insurance companies, other players to go to initiatives that are motivated by this institution. And another thing, I think when we talk about the MDBs, we are talking essentially for the traditional ones, but there are other players, very important ones. I remember about 10 years or more, I was in Berlin with the president of KfW, the Development Bank of Germany. And Mr. Schröder said, "Das ist unmöglich." It's incredible. We are so important and nobody pays attention to us. All the money, all the things are going to the World Bank, the IDB, the African. We have to have a club. Oh, a club, I thought we were going to have some wine, which we didn't have these days, you know? And the club is 25 development banks from Europe, Latin America, Japan, China, Africa, so forth. So one message in the studies, so good, is to try to coordinate efforts, not to isolate, to work together. So the message is very simple. Let's work on capital increment, governance, 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 to keep the professionalism, which is crucial, not political influence, heavy influence in the institutions, which unfortunately, what I can see now from outside, things are not as good as they used to be 20 years ago. So this is the message, but congratulations, excellent panel, and now it's your turn, Suma.
Thank you. Enrique, don't go away. Take my seat, take my seat.
I'm going to take your position.
You take my position, yes. I'm going to ask NK, we have 3 minutes between you and me. Just any final reflections from you from what you've heard, and then I'll close the session.
3 minutes is a long time, but 3 very brief comments. First brief comment, hearing all this excellent remarks, closing ones from you, Enrico, And a centerpiece of that this shareholders must really enable the multilateral development banks to be able to harness a lot of it by putting much more of the resources in enhancing the equity. It's a core question. It's a fundamental question. But Vera and I and other colleagues who are members of this independent expert group have not yet counted on Homi to write the history of the independent expert group's deliberations. If we did that, it would be far more fascinating, in my view, than the report itself. Because how we came around on this issue of the capital increase is simply this, that we had an option of putting that, the centerpiece, and one of the very distinguished members of my group, who I'm sure you're familiar with, but let him remain unnamed. He's from, he is from South America, was this, that we had an option of either doing that and bringing the report to an abrupt end, or orchestrating perhaps a roadmap which is more likely. So you can quite see what we have aimed at. Certainly, recapitalization of the banks would be important to make them bigger, to be able to inject market with the confidence that the shareholders are behind all this effort in prompting banks to take greater risks, and that they must share really and hold the hands of the bank in enabling them to take greater risks. Now, if you read the full text of our report, you will find that there is a bit of sequencing and orchestrating in the roadmap, which we have put in the last part, and I will stop at that. A very important issue was raised on the issue of governance and governance structure. And I think that, again, let me be honest and confess that we debated. We had an option of raising and going into that issue, but it would not have resulted in this report. So what have we done? We have done what is very classic: kick the can down for enabling another independent expert group in the fullness of time to be able to address that very complex but a very high priority issue. And I have been quite honest with you that we may not have made the most optimum choice, but we have made perhaps a choice which we felt was the most practical way forward. Thank you, Suma.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to take literally less than 1 minute, I think, just to sum up. I think, from my perspective, I think there are three things which really are pretty important going forward in terms of taking this report forward. Firstly, I think on the financing issue, the question of whether it's a sequential approach or all-in approach. So do we go with all the capital adequacy framework, G20 recommendations, but also with the capital increase at the same time? And I think that's a big issue for the shareholders. And, you know, kicking cans down the road, well, I've worked in finance ministries in the UK. We're good at that. So the question is whether the bigger shareholders can actually summon up the courage, really, that this is a time when they've got to do these things, not sequentially, but at the same time. Secondly, and the report says a lot about this, it's about the operational issues, particularly, I think, of taking this forward. And here's a challenge for management, I think, of the MDBs. And it's great that the MDB heads are now getting more closely together. It's really good news. I think there is, I suppose, a narrative in my mind that we get the money. We have a lot of money coming through, but we are chasing too few projects. You know, the inflation adage, too much money chasing too few goods. We have the same problem, not too much money perhaps, but a lot of money chasing too few projects. So what do we do to actually try and take forward some of the recommendations in the report on operationalizing this report making it actually available. And that's important for the private sector as well, reduces their transaction cost of engaging with the MDBs. Hassan Tuloy this morning talked a bit about that. I think that's a fundamental issue. And part of that also, I think, is to get more material from the borrowing countries about what they expect from the MDBs. And Homi and I have been talking about whether we can have more independent surveys. ODI did one a year and a half ago, but others could also do this, and not the MDBs themselves, because there's obviously an issue of conflicts of interest, but to get these in independent surveys in, so we actually really know what the borrowing countries want the MDBs to focus on. The third thing, having seen a number of these reports, is monitoring. Monitoring of the recommendations and taking them forward. I know this was debated in the expert group, but I think there is a call here, if you look at what happened with the Tharman report, the Zedillo report before that, for a need for some sort of independent monitoring group linked to the G20 that would actually try and focus on taking these recommendations forward and just produce progress reports for the major shareholders and all the shareholders, in fact, borrowing shareholders as well, to look at every 6 months or something like that. Some sort of monitoring mechanism is required. I want to leave you with one thought. I have read a lot of these reports. This is a fantastic piece of work. It's a brilliant piece of work. I think congratulations to NK, to Larry and Absentia, to the other members of the expert group, to Homi and the Secretariat, and all of those who pulled in their ideas, gave their time to this. It's the best thing I've read on this subject ever. It's now important to launch it, but it's even more important then to implement it. Thank you very much, audience.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a 15-minute coffee break in the foyer. We will reconvene in this auditorium